Right. It seems that we're live, so welcome to you all. And welcome to, kind of like an announcement that we of Yireo would like to make. A new adventure begins with an extension that Yireo wrote, a Loki checkout. And as you can see, the settings are awesome to start with a specific journey. And in this webinar, I'm hoping to introduce, first of all, the Loki checkout that I've been building. And on top of that Loki checkout, there's actually kind of like an underlying framework or technology called Loki components. And if I'm talking about the Loki checkout, I have to explain the Loki components as well. We're going to deal with the plans, the features, the pricing, the roadmap of this new checkout. But before we start with everything, I think it would be good to just make sure that whatever you have on your mind, questions that you might have, we're going to end this webinar with a Q&A, questions and answers. So if you want to, if you have a specific question on your mind, feel free to post that question on the YouTube channel. We're going to pick up upon any question towards the end of this webinar. And currently it's in Amsterdam time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We hope to end the webinar around 4 or maybe a little bit before. Which means that you're going to listen to me for 45 minutes or so, explaining more about the Loki checkout. And the recordings are going to be available as well. And the slides that you're seeing right now are going to be shared as well. Now, first of all, before I dive into the real matter of the checkout and the underlying technology of Loki components, let me briefly explain the concept of Loki, or actually more specifically where the name came from, because the name Loki actually rings a bell if you're into Norse mythology. I'm actually Dutch myself, so Norse mythology doesn't really apply. All of the pictures that you're going to see are depicting mountains, and in the Netherlands we don't have mountains, but it's from Norse mythology, and it's also that the name of Loki actually refers to a nephew of Baldur, and Baldur is actually a theme that Ruud, he was just briefly in this webinar as well, a theme that Ruud is building on top of the Hyvä themes system. Now, the main reason actually why I picked the name Loki is because he's the god of mischief. And the symbols are, first of all, the snake. So you're going to see the snake pop up so now and then. And then on the right-hand side, you're also able to see here Loki in ancient runes, so the old writing of the Vikings. And there's pure coincidence that there's this Marvel series about a guy similarly named. So I'm not going to focus upon that too much. But yeah, at least I mentioned the name Loki, and let's focus a little bit more upon what that Loki checkout is really about. So first of all, to my opinion, it's developer friendly. It has a focus to really make things easier for developers. The counter side of that is actually that I'm not making it easier for people that are only clicking in an admin panel. So a lot of settings are actually there in the XML layout and not in the Magento admin panel. Another huge point to make there is that the Loki checkout is a checkout extension available for both Hyvä themes and Luma. And a lot of Luma customers have been actually waiting for such a checkout. I already mentioned that it's based upon Loki components, but I'm going to comment upon Loki components in a bit far more. And then I'm also going to talk about innovative approaches, but that's kind of like my opinion. But I'm hoping that after watching this webinar, you're going to at least get a couple of the gestures I made towards the rest of the community through that Loki checkout. So I'm coming up with a couple of innovations that I'm hoping to pick up. I'm hoping that they're going to be picked up upon by the rest of the Magento community. All right, so that being said, I just wanted to get one thing out of the way, which is basically the pricing. This is not going to be a free extension. There's far too much work put into it, and even more work is going to be put into it as soon as the number of integrations and extensions is growing. So there's 3 pricing plans. standard, professional, and partner. And as of yet, the first focus is actually going to be on Loki professional, so the mid tier. A small €1,000 for the first year. Renewals are going to be $245. And the main difference between Loki professional and Loki standard is actually that with Loki professional, I'm really aiming for supporting customizations. And I'm going to comment upon that kind of like towards the end of the webinar, where I'm going to talk about what kind of features are already done and what kind of features are going to be there. But as soon as some third-party developer is going to dive into that, my aim for Loki Professional is really to help the developer help you build that task, and that's basically where that customization support comes in. On top of it, there's priority development. So if you need specific features, I'm just going to jump to the rescue. And that being said, it doesn't work if I'm having 1,000 customers. So I'm going to keep the number of customers, the number of agencies that are going to benefit from Loki at first. I'm going to keep that quite low. Meaning that Loki Professional is going to be rolled out in the next couple of weeks or so. Loki Standard and Loki Partner is only going to be available towards the summer, kind of. All right, so that being said, maybe it's just nice to start off with a demo. Normally we do this the other way around by just talking about features and so on. But I just wanted to turn it around. So here's a little demo of, first of all, the Hyvä themes based Loki checkout. And as you can see, the URL is freely available. It's going to be coming later. It's actually going to be shared online and in the slide set. But as you can see, there's this checkout and whatever I can do is make certain changes. So for instance, I can just fill in the address of my office space, and that's actually in Baarn in the Netherlands. And actually, I was playing around with this a little bit earlier. So for instance, if I'm a company, automatically actually two fields pop up, the company name and the VAT number. And of course I can fill in as a company name something like this. And I can fill in certain details which are going to be validated. So only if I'm actually using a valid VAT number, then actually this is going to be completed. Well, there's far more to do with this demo, and I'm not going to show you all as of yet. First of all, because the functionality is very broad already, and I first wanted to focus upon a little bit that you see, hey, this is the checkout. But later on, I'm also going to comment upon what else is there more by following the slides. But one of the main things of this Hyvä, this Loki checkout in Hyvä is basically that whenever I'm switching certain fields, the refreshes are going to be taken care almost instantly. And as you can see right here, for instance, if I'm switching the country, you can see that multiple parts of the page are refreshing. And of course, this is a demo which is optimized for for performance, but kind of like the performance and the feeling that you get from this demo is basically the same thing that you could get yourself as well. Now, I think this is it for now for the demo. So let me just try to switch back towards my presentation. Here we go. Because I feel like if I'm presenting my Loki checkout, I have to explain a couple of things. For instance, one of the most asked questions I got already was why on earth build a new checkout? Why actually undertake that specific feature? And instead of actually doing a comparison from the Loki checkout towards others, I actually wanted to focus upon the reasons why I wanted to build something like this. Well, first of all, with the Loki checkout, I'm hoping to bring a fast and reliable checkout, and I'm going to show you the technology in a bit. So through that technology, I'm able to explain why it's fast and why it's, in my opinion, reliable. Second, it's actually available as of yet for Hyvä themes and Luma. So with Hyvä, a lot of people already got their hands upon a beautiful checkout. With Luma, a lot of people were still stuck with the old Luma checkout, so the knockout require based system. And with the Loki checkout, basically, I have something else in offer. And as soon as we dive deeper into that technology, my wording is going to be technical. I'm going to make this developer oriented. And one of the things that I really got from other developers throughout the years that I've been teaching those developers as well, is actually that they wanted to have a certain technology for a checkout that stuck to the basic technology that they already knew. For instance, blocks and view models in the XML layout. And it's all right there in the Loki checkout doing something specifically. But that specific thing is actually the thing that I need to explain in more depth, because every specific block that is defined through the XML layout could be turned into a so-called dynamic component. And with dynamic, I basically mean that it's going to be turned into a combination of Tailwind and Alpine. Maybe a little sidestep, Tailwind and Alpine are already used in Hyvä themes. So if you're building sites with Hyvä themes, then this is already pretty familiar. However, in Luma, I'm actually doing that same thing. And that brings up a basic question like, hey, but if I'm adding CSS based upon Tailwind and Alpine JavaScript on top of a stack that is already large, does it do any good, or does it do actually any harm to the Luma system? And actually the benefit is huge. It's much faster. And I'm going to comment upon the Luma mechanism in a bit later on as well. But basically, the Loki checkout is based upon Tailwind and Alpine. Now, underneath, there's another thing going on, and that's slowly heading into this new technology that I developed called Loki components. And it's leading actually into faster AJAX calls with so-called bundled HTML updates. And if you paid a close look at what I just did in the demo, and this is something you can do yourself as well, then actually on the page with a little change like switching the country or toggling an individual company radio box, then actually from that simple AJAX call, multiple other pieces on the page were updated. And that's kind of like what I'm referring to. And it's something that was based upon a new library called Loki components. Now, that Loki components library is partially based upon PHP. So that's kind of like the normal stuff that we know as Magento developers. But part of it is also based upon Alpine or JavaScript. And this is actually one other reason that I had for developing the Loki checkout in the first place. While playing around with multiple different technologies, it hit me that I was actually in need of something that was able to do things on the client side and the server side. So both in JavaScript and in PHP, especially when it came to validation and filtering. So imagine basically that you're making a typo in an email address, which could easily be fixed or validated through JavaScript. Then you don't want to wait for an AJAX call to be updated before you actually get informed that the email address is just simply of a wrong format. So that's actually one main thing that I wanted to do. Make sure that there's client-side and server-side validation. And again, I'm going to talk about the underlying technology in a bit more. Now, another key point that I'm also going to illustrate is that I don't want you to create template overrides. And I personally think that this is kind of like an innovation. For years now, I've been educating developers in multiple different themes, in multiple different Magento technologies. And one thing that really is popping up in all of those stories is that along the line, a lot of people are creating template overrides and sometimes creating template overrides while they shouldn't. And that's actually one thing that I really focused upon with the Loki checkout to prevent basically template overrides. And I'm going to demo or talk about those template overrides a little bit more. But again and again and again, I'm referring to this other technology called Loki components. So Loki checkout is simply based upon another thing called Loki components, a little bit of Alpine, a little bit of AJAX, and a little bit of the Magento logic that you already know. However, what is kind of new is that I'm introducing a custom-made XML file, lokicomponents.xml. And through that XML file, you're defining a certain component. And a component is kind of like the same as a block in the XML layout, but then upgraded together with Alpine logic. On the Alpine level, there's a lot happening because of those filters and validations and other tricks that I mentioned. And because of that, actually, I came up with an extensible Alpine component system and a component type system. And again, I'm going to show this in a bit more. But maybe one word already. A lot of the developers I talked to, as soon as I started with Alpine or JavaScript in the first place, then their reaction is, "Oh no, this is something I don't want to do." And the good news with Loki components, and therefore with the Loki checkout, is actually that you can do a lot of things without actually doing anything with Alpine. But the option is there, so it's fully extensible. Now, one thing that really tear myself apart was a decision I needed to make early December or a little bit before that. Before that time, the Loki checkout was actually based not upon Loki components, but simply MageWire. And I personally love MageWire, and I think MageWire is really still one of the golden things in the Magento ecosystem. However, along the line, I discovered that the Loki checkout was doing more and more on the client side. And the very purpose of MageWire is that you don't need to do things on the client side. And sooner or later, I just made the cut. Like, I was not depending upon MageWire too much anymore, and I was actually better off without it. And it doesn't mean that MageWire is bad. It actually means that as soon as you do more and more things upon the Alpine level or upon the JavaScript level, then it might be that actually MageWire is a tool that is making things too simple, while you actually want it to become more complex. Theoretically, Loki components comes back into the game at that moment. Now, another thing is that the Loki components are basically making simple AJAX calls to the Magento backend, so a specific Magento controller. And then actually they come back with a specific response. And that response is just simple HTML with multiple div elements or other elements being rendered. And then actually the Loki component client-side part is able to dissect all of those HTML updates from that response and update all of the different HTML areas on screen. And that's all being done actually in a single HTTP request. So that final bullet point that you see right here is actually making up for a lot of the performance stuff that I'm going to talk about. Now, a couple of things that I wanted to mention about those features are basically also really oriented towards developers. So here you can see two screenshots. The one on the back, or actually on the left-hand side, is just a simple piece of XML layout. So within the XML layout, you're able to declare a specific block. And one thing that is kind of like mandatory in the Loki components architecture is to come up with a unique name. Well, that unique name needs to be there in the XML layout anyway. But now, because that name is actually something that is used by Loki components to identify that specific block, I really want to make sure that you think about that block name in a proper way. Anyway, so once you've got a block defined with a unique name, then actually in this etc Loki components.xml file, you can duplicate that name and just turn it into a component. And as you can see right here, there's three different features then added on top of it. First of all, there's a view model. It's just a view model, but that view model is automatically assigned to the template. Plus, there's other interconnections between a view model and a repository. And this is not kind of like the same as a product repository or an order repository. So I often refer to this as a component repository. But the component repository is responsible for updating entries and receiving data again from a storage mechanism like a session or the quote. So the view model and the repository are two classes that you can then add to your component. And then the third part here is that in this case, a like button is automatically making sure that whatever the value is that is submitted from the client side, the browser, towards the server is always made numeric. And I'm making it really easy to come up with filters and validators through this XML. And then it's a little bit up to you whether you want to implement that filter or validator on the client side in JavaScript or on the server side on the PHP level, or both. And then automatically the component architecture is just picking up upon it. Now, I'm telling a story here of a simple Loki component, and there's already a lot to say here. But in this case, actually, the example is a non-checkout example, and it's just turning apparently a block into a certain thing called a component. The next step is basically a little demo. The purpose is to do exactly this. There's a button on the page, you click upon it, there's notifications forth and back, and as you can see, every time there's a specific AJAX call towards the server, and that's responsible for updating the current component, so the current block area, while actually the very value that you're submitting to the server is saved as well. And I'm doing that actually through this repository class. So here you can see the complete repository class. It's extending upon this bare bones component repository class. And as you can see, there's two mandatory methods: get value, save value. And save value is just being used here to retrieve a value from the customer session, and then also doing some notifications. On the left-hand side, you can still see a little bit of the screenshot of the view model. And as you can see, it's empty, meaning that you could also just play around with this example without actually having a view model. And if I go a couple of slides back, here you can see that XML definition with a specific view model, but the whole example would have worked also without that view model definition in the first place. Now, the goal here is basically to build something like this on a molecular level. So basically, I set out to build demos of simple components based upon this Loki component architecture. And only once that was working, I actually jumped into building the more complete or the more complex Loki checkout. But the underlying technology is basically the same. And it allows for a lot of modification. So in the screenshots shown just now, the whole architecture is based upon AJAX, but note that there was zero JavaScript that you needed to deal with. So thanks to the abstraction of Loki components, you can build your own Loki component without doing anything on the Alpine level. However, if you want to do that, you could. And because of that, actually, I'm differentiating between component types, components, and component instances. And if you've worked a little bit with Alpine through, for instance, Hyvä, then it's good to note that actually a component instance is basically the thing that you're normally doing. However, a component instance is then an instance of a component. So that very thing that you declare through x-data. And it's just that with Loki components, I was just building so many different components that I wanted to have some kind of reusability, and component types are the way to get there. On top of it, thanks to all of those component types and existing components, there's validations, filters, messages, and a lot more. And just to comment upon those Loki component types, on the left-hand side, you see this bare bones Loki component type, from which a lot of other component types are simply extending. And what is a component type? Well, it's nothing more than just an object. So there's an object with properties, methods, and methods within methods, and a little bit more of magic. But thanks to this functionality, any kind of component or block that is upgraded towards a Loki component that is simply extending upon a Loki component type, so that first example on the left, is automatically benefiting from validations, messaging, post behavior, so the AJAX call itself, etc. Now, specifically for the checkout, I needed to have a couple of other things. So that's actually shown by the screenshot in the middle. For instance, if you have a step-based checkout, so for instance, a shipping step and a billing step, then actually every component needs to be registered with what kind of step it's on to allow for detecting whether a certain step is finished, so you can proceed to the next step. And I'm currently working still upon a certain feature that allows you to have Loki components also based upon lazy loading, which is nice if you want to use a Loki component somewhere else on pages that are actually cached through the full page cache mechanism. So note, at this moment, it's fully in development, but full page cached components are not supported yet. Who cares? It's the checkout. On the other hand, within the checkout, there could also be specific components like payment methods of a certain payment provider that are just simply slow to load, and therefore you simply also want to toggle that flag lazy loading. And again, the feature of lazy loading is based upon JavaScript, but in the end, it's just something that you can toggle in component settings on the server side, so in the XML or in the on the PHP level, or theoretically even on the XML layout level, and then actually the Loki components architecture is just doing the rest. On the right-hand side, finally, there's a real-life component, in this case, Loki checkout edit cart, and that's actually based upon that Loki checkout base component type. So using the ... exploding features of JavaScript, you can basically see that I'm kind of like building extensibility or inheritance based upon components. And I think personally that that's to the very least already a little bit new to the whole system. Now, while developing Loki components, I really felt the need to debug whatever I was doing. So out of the box, there's also this Loki component debugger. It's shipping with actually two different features. First of all, an overview of all of the Loki components that are present on the page. And as you can see, this is actually not all of the components that are there in the checkout. The listing is actually only 1/3. The shown listing is only 1/3 of the total. But as soon as you have more components, you simply want to know what kind of components are there. And second, the debugger also ships with a server dump. That's just simply a little bit of tracking of what goes on in that AJAX call. And as you can see right here in the server dump, there's a component name, Loki checkout sidebar items item, and that's actually equal to the block name in the XML layout. We can see that the view model and a repository are being called. We can see what kind of validators are being called. And as a result, what kind of HTML areas are going to be refreshed. So for instance, in this case, there's the global messages being refreshed. The debugger itself is being refreshed. And in short, this Loki component debugger is just a great help once you want to develop more with Loki components. Now, this slide is just kind of like in there to illustrate what is going on there with all of the Loki component stuff. But instead of actually doing that, I wanted to jump again into a little demo. So let me actually go back to the page I was on earlier. But actually not right here. I'm actually going to jump to the home page because there's a little set of different Loki components. And every Loki component is something that you can install in the end yourself quite easily. And the demos that I just came up with in the slides are basically also based upon everything like this. Now, the reason why I wanted to pop up this little demo is just to illustrate what goes on actually underneath with such an AJAX call. So for instance, if I want to demo a global notice, then you can see that there's a Loki component right here to have that button. But likewise, there's actually notices itself as well, so messages. And that's basically two different components that are going to be refreshed at the same time. And the AJAX call itself always gets a certain payload. Component data, that's kind of like the thing that you would like to change. The handles needed for the XML layout handling. And then actually another thing that is really Loki component specific targets, because those are actually going to be translated back into the block IDs or the block names in the XML layout, so that the system knows what kind of response to render. And then here you can see actually that in the response, there's basically all of the HTML that is just rendered from the blocks that are involved, including the messages, including the component that I was just playing around with, and yeah, theoretically also the Loki component debugger. However, that's currently disabled on this specific demo. So as you can see, there's an AJAX call, and that AJAX call is basically in the middle of everything else. And that's kind of like explaining what is also happening within the Loki checkout. So first of all, I demoed a little bit about the Loki components architecture, and that's just because it's the beginning of the entire adventure of the Loki checkout. And thanks to that architecture of Loki components, I'm building forms, form fields, well, all kinds of different things that are there. And as mentioned, because the Loki components are built based upon Alpine, as soon as you add Alpine to any kind of theme out there, Luma, Hyvä, Breeze, theoretically, and others, then automatically it's just working. And currently I'm focusing upon Luma and Hyvä to begin with. Well, and the cool part about Luma is that there's again a demo, but I'm just skipping that part just to make sure that I'm ending up with the story in time. As you can see right here, all of the functionality is there. It's still based upon Alpine. It's still fast as well compared to the Luma one-step checkout. And it's just that all of the features are still based upon Alpine, the same PHTML and the same Tailwind classes. And I'm actually mentioning something there. So currently the Luma build is based upon Tailwind, simply because all of the Tailwind classes are there for Hyvä users, and I prefer Hyvä instead of actually dealing with Luma. However, you could also just disable Tailwind within Luma and skip to other CSS frameworks if you want to. So I'm trying to make this independent from the theming level that you're dealing with. So theoretically, the Snowdog SAS themes would also be building on top of this same thing, and it would be working without an issue. So there we go. I explained already a little bit about that mechanism of having multiple HTML updates. A little bit of a cool demo, but I also did this already for real in the demo. As soon as we switch a country, then actually multiple different parts of the page, they need to be refreshed. And that's all taken care of by the same technology. So whatever was happening with a Loki component with a simple like button is basically the same thing here. It's just that the definition of the country component needs to be mentioning what kind of other HTML elements are going to be updated. And that's being done by defining them as a target in that same XML file that I talked about earlier. And then through those targets, the Loki component system knows what to update. Now there's other utilities inside the Loki checkout specifically that are not yet or not in the Loki component system. One of them is, for instance, the CSS class utility. And it's actually one of the reasons why I mentioned that template overrides should not be happening, thanks to this mechanism. So the mechanism is quite simple to use, but it's leading into multiple different questions. First of all, on the left-hand side, you can see a PHTML template, and normally where the class is HTML attribute would be starting, you would be typing no PHP, but just directly the CSS classes that you want to have in there. Field, WAuto, relative. So the second two CSS classes are actually based upon Tailwind. The field class is just more a utility class. But theoretically, then with a template existing in Hyvä themes, for instance, as soon as you want to modify those CSS classes, then normally a lot of people are just creating a template override. And the bad thing about template overrides is basically that if you do that once or twice and then 20 times or 100 times, then actually the legacy of your own theme goes up. So one of the aims that I had with creating this CSS util framework or and utility is basically to not require a template override anymore when it comes to simple CSS class overrides. As you can see, $CSS is referring to a function. And that function is just translating the current block with its ID, with its name, so that you can use XML layout arguments to either override all of the CSS classes or actually extend them. And as you can see on the right hand side screenshot, CSS class is basically the beginning. The root element, so that's the PHTML element that was shown here in the top left. So div class and then 3 classes, field, WAuto, relative. I can override actually those classes by sticking to an XML layout structure, CSS classes, block, and then default, but I'm not mentioning an item name default. I'm actually adding an item name is grid. And because of that, actually, it's not overriding things, but extending upon the Tailwind classes. Now, I hope that you're following along with me, because one of the feedbacks that I got from this system is, yes, it does allow for a lot of flexibility. Yes, it's making sure that if you're only modifying CSS classes, you can do so in the XML layout and not have any template overrides. but no, it's not that easy. So I'm kind of like wondering whether this is a good solution. On the other hand, the div in the HTML is going to be accompanied with an HTML ID that is automatically being generated, and that automatically generated ID, which is equal to another CSS class, could be used in CSS to just do things with overrides there. But I don't really care what you do with your CSS modifications. Either you do that through the XML layout, or you do that on the CSS class level, but don't do that with a template override, because that's just a waste of resources and creating a huge legacy on the long run. So that's one of the things that I hope to have solved with this CSS utility. And the question mark is whether everyone is understanding it and favoring this. But at least I'm trying my best to improve things. And as you can see right here, I've done my best to actually not only create a new architecture, both for Loki components and Loki checkout, but I'm also trying to make sure that it's flexible and easy to debug on a developer level. And that developer focus is definitely something I really want to be focusing upon. Leading actually into one more other area, which is that I'm trying to anticipate certain customizations. And I have to note that some of these customizations are already there in the Loki checkout as of yet. So, for instance, to build a custom filter, a custom validator, either on the PHP level or the JavaScript level, is kind of easy. Conditional fields, it's something that I already demoed with multiple different things. EU VAT validation. So, a couple of the things that you can see in this listing are already supported. Some other things are going to be supported, but yet more other things are maybe not going to be supported by me, but are maybe just going to be built by you. And at that moment, when you're building such a feature, instead of actually bumping into a brick wall where you find out that my architecture is not good enough to build that specific feature, I want to turn that around and basically say, I'm not here to just take your money and say, okay, that's it. No, instead, I would like to focus upon a collaborated development. And that's actually where I came up with the pricing and the packages. I'm going to sit down with you as a customer, as a developer, just to make sure that those customizations that you're looking for are going to be built in the right way. And maybe that means that you need to learn from me how to do that in the right way. But it could also be that I need to change certain things in the architecture just to allow for that specific scenario. So one example there, for instance, is swapping, shipping, and billing, which is always kind of like a nightmare. Out of the box, I'm going to choose that first shipping is going to be shown and then billing. However, I'm already building the components and the architecture to allow swapping with all of the caveats that it's coming with. Yet another feature that is on the listing, skip billing for free products. Well, I do know that Magento requires a billing address, even though the product that you're purchasing is free. So I'm going to examine actually what the best way would be to build that. And theoretically, that's not going to be part of the Loki checkout suite itself. Theoretically, it's not going to be stable. But to the very least, I'm hoping to experiment together with you to make that work. So there's a lot of things there, and I already featured a couple of things, specific things that I've built. I demoed a couple of things, as you can see for yourself later on as well. The links to the demos, the links to everything are going to be shared here on the YouTube channel. But I found it a good idea as well to just look ahead a little bit, what is ahead in the future. And it's starting actually with maybe looking back a little bit in Q2, Q3, I slowly came up with ID. And at that moment, I was actually looking for a checkout, not for anyone else, but just for myself. I always mentioned that sooner or later, I wanted to build a checkout for myself from scratch. But then somewhere in Q4, I decided, hey, but this is something worth to a lot of other people. And that's actually where the core development started, the first integrations, the first client project. And currently it's the beginning of January, and I'm about to kick off a private beta program. I have to admit that I don't know all of the caveats of such a private beta program. A lot of different agencies, a lot of different developers already signed up with me. So if you're interested, do reach out so we're able to discuss things. And that private beta program is going to be turned into a Loki professional plan, as mentioned earlier. But I don't want to become crazy. So the first step is actually to focus only on Dutch agencies. And it doesn't mean that the checkout and the components are not available for Dutch non-Dutch people, but it's more that my personal effort needs to go into a smaller set of extensions, the Dutch payment providers, the Dutch shipping providers, specific Dutch settings, and so forth. And that's kind of like the focus for Q1. In Q2, as you can see already, I'm coming up with all of the other plans, and I'm also going to open source all of the technology of Loki components, so that theoretically there's more Loki stuff happening elsewhere in the Magento application. But that's a little bit up to you and all of the others that are going to be playing around with Loki components to see whether it's something for the community. Now, maybe to also step back a little bit, what is already then done in more detail? Well, there's a component logic system. There's multiple themes that you can choose from. At this moment, only two different themes, a multi-step and a single-step checkout. All of the core settings of Magento are supported already out of the box. I've built an EU VAT validation that works nicely. Most of the important Dutch Molly payment methods are supported already out of the box as well. And it's just that a couple of more details ones like Apple Pay, they're giving me headaches, but I'm aiming actually for completing that in the next upcoming weeks. A post-CodeNL integration is already up and running, and I created a couple of other things that are just nice to have. An account type, so toggling between individual and company, so that if you're choosing a company to be a company, that automatically the VAT ID and the company field are going to be shown. Order commands, so that you can add an order comment, and editing the cart. I just demoed this quickly already. And the number of modules because of this is slowly growing. Now, there's a lot to tell more about all of this, but in the near future, I'm going to work upon more Dutch payment providers. I'm going to work upon shipping providers. And in short, there's a lot more to do with the checkout, but I'm happy to pick up upon all of that. So if you're interested, more is going to be coming soon. I'm planning actually to do more webinars, but also come up with documentation, more documentation, I have to say, and other things. That's actually one thing that I almost forgot, but I already mentioned that there's a site mentioning a specific couple of things. So this is the lokicheckout.com site. It's mentioning a couple of benefits. It's mentioning a couple of features. And in the end, it's also mentioning the demos that are currently available and the pricing that I already mentioned earlier. And then on the top right, you can jump to the documentation part. And that's currently undergoing a lot of different changes because of that change and shift in architecture that I mentioned earlier. But as of yet, I think actually a lot of the pages already worked around, and you can use that to get an impression on the developer level what that checkout is actually like. So my aim is to extend upon that documentation more while I also develop more and more extensions and integrations. So if you have any interest in the private beta program, do let me know. Also, if you have any other questions, do let me know as well. A couple of closing notes while we still have room for Q&A as well. As mentioned, the live stream is actually going to be recorded to YouTube. Well, you're right now in YouTube, and it's going to be saved towards the Yireo YouTube channel. And later on, I'm also going to post again more quick pick videos explaining specific details about the Loki checkout. On the other hand, I'm still busy with trainings as well. So I've helped actually a lot of different developers dealing with Magento 2 front-ending and back-ending. And sooner or later, I'm going to add courses on the Loki checkout as well. And currently that's scheduled for something towards the summer. So cross fingers that I can stick to all of that. And apart from the Loki checkout, I'm still happy to do a lot of other things as well. So the webinar in this case was really focused upon something that I almost perceive as something commercial. But other webinars I organized in the past were really for the community. And in the upcoming webinars, we're going to focus on Hyvä and Figma design tokens, more Loki stuff theoretically, and other topics like testing are on my mind as well. So do make sure to take note of all of the different things that I'm still doing apart from Loki. But that being said, there might be specific questions. So if I'm looking a little bit towards Ruud to see if we are ready for specific questions. Let me see. Then actually it's kind of quiet, I believe. All right. Let me just wait for it a little bit more. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to mix in. And on the other hand, if you've got any questions afterwards, that's perfectly fine as well. So I'm actually seeing a couple of questions already pop up on YouTube. So, for instance, Gerard is asking what kind of feature matrix is currently planned and present. Well, I kind of like ended with that specific part. However, then it's only part of the slide set, and I'm aiming for turning that slide set and my own to-do into something on the documentation side. So somewhere in the documentation, there's going to be a listing of all of the features that are currently working and the features that are going to be planned. Another question from Gerhard is, will Loki checkout be compatible with Adobe Commerce Cloud? Well, yeah, theoretically it is already compatible. And it's kind of like due to the same thing that happened with Loki, with Luma, I have to say. That automatically, while I made things compatible with Hyvä, it was on my mind that I didn't want to depend upon Hyvä in the first place. So Tailwind and Alpine is part of the same stack, but it's not necessarily requiring you to deal with Hyvä themes. And then actually, while I started testing with things, I was kind of shocked that Luma was just working out of the box. I personally think that that's going to happen the same for Adobe Commerce. So yes, I would say that because Adobe Commerce is kind of like the same core as Magento open source as of yet, compatibility would be in there. However, a second question would be if Yireo is eager to pick up upon the support, and that's actually currently a big question mark. So as of yet, I don't have a lot of clients that are really looking into using the Loki checkout together with Adobe Commerce. Another question from Rick. To me, Loki component sounds a little bit like MageWire version 3 Lite. You're damn right. Do you intend for Loki components to be a full alternative for MageWire in the future, or will there be a future where we use both? Well, I think first of all, it's up to the developers to decide. And as you can see, indeed, with MageWire 3, there's a specific feature that allows for updating multiple different components on the page. So theoretically, feature-wise, it could be that the Loki checkout, the Loki components is going to be very, very similar to MageWire 3. I personally didn't want to wait too much, and also I found out that actually Loki components is really allowing me to build a lot more client-side, so with client-side validations and filters and messaging and etc. While currently with MageWire 1, it felt that it was a little bit of a struggle. But I think personally that they both have their own how do you say that in English? Their own use case to the very least. And I truly believe that actually MageWire is going to be part of the rest of the future of Magento as well. Whether Loki is up to it, well, that's a little bit up to how you receive everything. But I personally would say that both could coexist for quite a long time. Gerhard is asking, or let me actually jump towards a document that we had. No, I'm doing fine. I'm just reading everything from the YouTube channel. So Gerhard, if I understand correct, you told a Hyvä MageWire checkout tries not to do things on the client side and Loki Checkout do things different. Does that mean that Loki Checkout is more a benefit on headless approaches? No, definitely no. A headless approach would be something based upon PWA Studio or Vue Storefront, which is now Alokai. And with those headless approaches, everything is happening client side, which means that you don't have a server side rendered front end anymore. And you're stepping away from the monolith of Magento. So with that, the Loki Checkout wouldn't work unless you actually have a client-side shop with only the checkout being natively styled again using the XML layout and blocks and view models. But I personally would say that indeed the Loki checkout and the Hyvä MageWire checkout resemble more. It's just that with the MageWire checkout, well, as the name says it, MageWire is really one of the key elements, and it was therefore adding workarounds to allow for Alpine to be used instead. And I did that actually. I went that route, but the more I did that, and I decided actually to do that for every single component out there, I just realized that actually I didn't need MageWire anymore. Everything was already client-side, so Alpine based. In the documentation online, there's going to be actually more reasoning about why I made this decision. So feel free to come up with it. What about supported checkout third-party modules like payments and shipping methods? Well, the Loki checkout part is dead easy. It's just that with payment methods specifically, shipping methods are a lot of times easier, but with payment methods specifically, there's all kinds of different hacks going on within the payment modules. So slowly I need to go through all of that to make sure that it's something I can click together with the Loki checkout. That being said, a lot of those workarounds and a lot of those hacks within those payment methods are actually JavaScript based. And out of the box already, the Loki checkout is, well, heavily JavaScript based as well, meaning that there's out of the box JavaScript events that payment providers can hook into. Overriding specific templates for the look and feel is quite easy. So I personally felt that the Molly integration, for instance, and next up is a Buckaroo integration, that those integrations were heavily focused not upon the Loki checkout, but actually understanding what the heck was going on within that extension itself. K. Apartment is mentioning, have you been inspired by HTOS systems such as HTMX when architecturing Loki? Yes and no. I've tried them all: HTMX, Symfony UI components or Live components, Livewire, MageWire. And there was also within the Alpine community a specific Alpine AJAX plugin. And I duplicated a lot of the features, but I just went for my own because I realized actually that the main thing that I wanted to do was just allow for a simple AJAX call, HTML to come back and just update the page. So in the end, Loki components is just fairly easy. And I was not looking for a complete how to say that, melting together of HTML and PHP altogether. I just wanted to have AJAX calls, and that was it. Ruben is asking, how's the support for extension attributes? Well, as of yet, I'm not playing around with that too much. However, earlier in the slides, you were seeing hopefully that a component, a Loki component on the server-side level, has a view model and a repository. And that repository simply just allows you to do, well, any PHP call that you would like to do. So if your extension attribute is already set up in the right way, if that extension attribute is hooking into a cart interface or a quote or theoretically shipping method or whatever, then actually making that work on the Loki component level is just simply calling upon it in the right place. And later on, I'm actually going to document all of this as well. So it's going to be supported out of the box, to say the very least. Yet another question from Rick. What would be the custom validation flow? What would it look like? Will we have to define our own validations in both PHP or JavaScript, or do you have a solution in mind to combine them? Actually, the system, which is partially already documented on the Loki checkout documentation site, is, first of all, you need to register your own validation. within a di.xml file. And that di.xml file basically is based upon a type, di type, for a validator registration, a validator registry or a filter registry. And that registration actually says, okay, I've got a name, foobar, and a PHP class, which is implementing then a validation interface or a filter interface. And as soon as that binding is done, then the name foobar could be easily assigned by using the XML level or XML layout or PHP level towards a specific component. So there's a little bit more setup to deal with, but that setup allows you to actually come up with custom validations and filters that are quite reusable. So for instance, whether a field is required or not, that's a validator. And that required validator exists both on the PHP level and on the JavaScript level. And as soon as actually that setup is done, then actually the validator itself has just a name required. And then through the Loki component XML, you can just add such a validation to any kind of component if it's already not there, because an email address is always required. So I'm also hooking into the required field or attribute of the EAV attributes, so the Magento core. But I would say that it's pretty extensible, and I'm already using it for more complex scenarios. So for instance, postcode NL is using that validation, but only on the PHP level. EU VAT validation is also happening with that mechanism on the server side. But there's also a basic VAT ID validation on the client side, just to make sure that whatever you're entering does make sense. So I would say that it's pretty extensible. And K Apartment is also mentioning, I must say, I really like the approach of talking in HTML rather than JSON objects between the server and client. I actually played around with JSON responses as well. And that was a complete nightmare, because it could be that the component that you're refreshing is also containing JSON data. So then you have JSON within JSON, theoretically within JSON. And on top of it, it could also be that there's JavaScript, which is then unpacked in a wrong way. So the more I got into it, the more I found that actually the HTML response was the simplest. And for the thing that I wanted to deal with, it actually serves the purpose wonderfully. So in the meantime, I've been talking for about 1 hour, and I don't see any additional questions pop up as of yet. We have another question from Rick. Do we have access to the contents of other fields in these custom validations? Yes, you do. So basically, within a validation rule, so that's a PHP class, what you could simply do is make sure that the validation is calling upon a helper method or a helper class called address state. And whatever is already there in quote is something that you can just pull in. The funny thing is actually also on the JavaScript level, every validator is actually called by a component, an Alpine component. And I've built actually something that allows for Alpine components to be registered. Halfway in my presentation, I talked about the Loki component debugger toolbar, and that debugger toolbar was basically showing all of the components that are part of a certain component registry on the client side, which means that even on the client side, you can go from one component to another. And I didn't really mention it, but the Alpine discussion panel on GitHub is basically mentioning a couple of times that people are wondering how to communicate from one Alpine component to another. And I've built actually a solution which is basically just having a registry in between. So one Loki component is able to communicate with another component simply by just putting in the other component from its name. And that's actually where you can create fun stuff. And I'm still halfway of experimenting things, but I'm not sure if I should tell this, but if you know knockout and UI components of Magento, especially in the backend, then you might know that UI components could be intertwined by using imports and exports, and actually having imports and exports working at the same time. Well, theoretically, my architecture allows for the same thing, but I'm just scared shitless for that thing to happen. So let's keep it simple and stupid. I think we're slowly heading towards the end of the webinar, but I still see one question popping up from Ruben. how comparable is your VAT validation with GuysWeb, for example? Well, I already had contact with Mr. Guys, Sven, and we actually got kind of like into an agreement that there is going to be an integration between the Loki checkout, and his GuysWeb VAT extension. It's just that his extension is doing a lot more than just my extension. So on my extension is simply calling upon the VAT validation library that is already part of Magento. However, sometimes the VAT VIES server is down, and that's actually where GuysWeb or Sven built a fallback mechanism, and likewise he's doing a couple of other smart things. So I'm eager to actually have my own VAT ID validation extension already there, but also hook into his logic as well on top of that. Another question came in from Skylands, but I can see that he also mentioned, never mind the question, because his question, I think, is kind of like the same as Ruben's. And it's maybe nice to maybe comment upon that in another way. While preparing for this webinar, I actually had talks with multiple different agencies in the Netherlands, and they all told me basically the same, that there's kind of like a set amount of features that every checkout always needs. And that's payment methods, that's on the shipping method, postcode NL, DHL, and a few others. That's EU VAT validation, so through GuysWeb, or theoretically my own extension, and then maybe a couple of others. But I'm really working upon finalizing at this moment that specific feature set, so that to the very least a simple shop that is occurring quite a lot could be built already out of the box with my Loki checkout suite. Adrian is still asking, how easy is it to add a terms and conditions checkbox at the end of the form, which would conditionally place the order? It's supported out of the box. It's just that the terms and conditions that I've currently built are part of the Loki checkout core component, and next week I'm actually going to move it out into a separate extension. But indeed, it's just basically using the built-in logic of terms and conditions, and making sure that if you don't agree upon those terms and conditions, that you're not able to place the order. So that's actually supported out of the box. Ruben is still asking, how high up is P&L on your wish list for payment providers? Well, it's in the top 5, but basically this is also where I slowly need to become more commercial. During the private beta program, I'm really hoping for developers to take a look at the code, comment upon things that might be breaking in the future, or dramatic changes in the architecture that still need to be there. But as soon as that private beta program is wrapped up, I'm actually going to head for the commercial release of the Loki checkout. And at that moment, it's basically that I'm going to work with any agency that signs up to build features like this. So P&L, I'm just not sure if it's going to pop up in the next 2 months or whether it's going to be the next 3 months. So let's see. Well, if you have a need for it, just let me know, I would say. Well, I think we're reaching the end of the webinar. Again, I've been talking for about an hour, and I could talk much more. I personally feel that we've just scratched the surface of the Loki checkout and Loki components. So I would say that much more is going to be happening in the near future, and keep on tuned. If you have any questions, still feel free to reach out. The slides and a couple of other links are going to be posted to the YouTube channel. So I would say thank you very much for listening in, and I hope to see you back soon with some Loki stuff. Thank you, guys.